Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're coming from. My name is Stephen Zacharias, and I am a museum educator here at the Rockpile Museum in Campbell County, Wyoming, located in Gillette. And today, we're really excited to be doing another live virtual program for you with our special guest. He's a best-selling author, singer, songwriter, storyteller, and musician. His name is Mifflin Lowe. He's here to talk to us today about one of his latest works, The True West. Real stories about black cowboys, women sharpshooters, Native American rodeo stars, pioneering vaqueros, and the unsung explorers, builders, and heroes who shaped the American West. We're really excited to be talking about this wonderfully illustrated children's book. We do have copies available here in the gift shop at the museum. So come on down, pick one up for your family's library. In addition to talking about his book, we're also going to talk about some of the individuals who didn't make it in Mifflin's book, but they made it right here in Powder River Basin and are similar characters to the characters that are mentioned in this book. But before we get into that, I want to welcome Mifflin virtually from his home in Rhode Island. Good morning, sir, or afternoon in your case.
How do you do? Yeah, hey, thanks a bunch.
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for doing this. I do want to ask, can you give us a little bit about your background and also how you came up with the idea for putting this children's book together?
Yeah, thanks. I'm a writer. I've been a writer forever and ever, and I've done lots of different kinds of books. The best-selling one was a humor book called The Cheapskate's Handbook, which sold in like 5 different languages and stuff. And then I did children's books too for Doubleday, but I did one called Cowboy Howie, which is about a young kid from New York City who desperately wanted to be a cowboy. You know, when he'd walk down the street, he'd see, the tall buildings would become the Grand Canyon, and he'd see a lady in a fur coat and she'd become a grizzly bear in his imagination, right? And he'd see like a dog and it would become a wolf, and like a hose would become a snake. And I love this book. And it's about a kid. His mother's black, his father's white, and he wanted to be a cowboy. And it's on. You can check it out on Amazon or on my website. Can I push that right now? It's called Loco Kids, LOCOKIDS, and it's like you can check out the whole book. I put all the pictures on there, Cowboy Howie, along with some of the songs from it, because I was going to make it an animated movie. Actually, still working on that. And I went to a publisher, Bushel and Peck, and I pitched them that book, and I said, one thing that I've realized doing lots of shows at libraries and at schools and so forth is that nobody knows that there were any black cowboys at all, right? And they said, well, why don't you do that book? Okay, so I said, yeah, sure, yeah. So it was great, interesting, fascinating people, and we did that one that you showed before, and it's available obviously on Amazon, but I'd say they should get it from you, because like Amazon's kind of sold out a lot of times, and same with Barnes and Nobles. So if they can get it at your museum, in addition to supporting your museum, they will also be able to get the book. Okay. And it's been recommended, listen to me, just blither on, by the Children's Book Council as an award-winning book on social studies and history for this year, which is a great honor. And it's gotten all kinds of like real good reviews from the American Library Association and so on and so forth. So very, very, very proud of it and very happy about how well it's done.
Well, it is an excellent book. I got copies for all my nieces and nephews this Christmas. Everybody loves it. The other thing I love about your book is, while it might be geared towards children, it's a great launching pad into people who want to do more research on these topics or these individuals, because it is history that is often overlooked or not in the everyday U.S. history class. But this children's book is a great launching pad into discovering parts of American history that are often overlooked. And it's beautifully illustrated, by the way. I do want to add that.
Yeah, you're right.
But so today, what I would like to do is, we of course don't have a whole lot of time to go through the entire book, but I was hoping we could highlight some of the individuals in your book, and where I can, I'll help pepper in some of the local characters from our local history here in the Powder River Basin that are in line with some of the things you talk about. So I'm going to turn it over to you now, and we'll get going with highlighting some of the histories found in your book.
Yeah, well, one thing I want to say, this book is about, like, my whole function as a writer is to be accurate and honest. Okay, that's what I want to do. I'm not pushing any point of view at all. But diversity is a fact of life in the true West, and there were all different types of people from all different backgrounds, all ethnicities and so forth involved. And a lot of people didn't even know that. So that's basically sort of the thrust of this book. But it includes people like you've probably already heard of, like Wild Bill Hickok and Annie Oakley and Calamity Jane, as well as, the Native Americans and Black men and women.
Yeah, there are some excellent stories here in this book. So I'm really excited to have you here sharing with us today.
Thanks. So, okay. So first one I want to talk about is Bill Pickett. And Bill Pickett was a guy who he was a rodeo star, and he invented what is called bulldogging. Now, are people out there familiar with bulldogging? It's when you ride on a horse after a steer or a bull, and he jumped down from his horse, grabbed the steer around the neck, and he would bite its upper lip to gain control of the animal and then wrestle it to the ground. And it's called bulldogging because apparently that's what the bulldogs who used to help herd the steer and so forth would do. They bite the beast on its upper lip, and I guess that seems like it would be awful painful to me. And it was enough painful for them to kind of weaken them and make them controllable. All right, and so that's what he did in all these rodeo shows. Like there's one called the 101 Ranch Wild West Show, which was a fantastic Wild West show, and included like Buffalo Bill at the time, Tom Mix, and Will Rogers, and he that was his big act was bulldogging. All right, and the amazing thing is, after doing this for a whole long time, he still had enough teeth left to become a movie star. All right. And he was in some of the early movies, before they were even talkies. One was called, The Bulldogger, obviously. And another one was called The Crimson Skull. And he was pretty successful at that, as successful as any black movie star was likely to be back in like 1919, right? And then he became friends with Will Rogers, and he died, ironically, I suppose, when he got kicked in the head, not by a bull, but by a horse. And his friend, Will Rogers, the great humorist, gave him a great eulogy. And that's that for Bill Pickett.
Well, I do want to interject for those of you from the Intermountain West, the longest running all black rodeo is in honor of Bill Pickett. It's the Bill Pickett Rodeo Invitational, and it's held every January in Denver, Colorado around Martin Luther King Day, and it still tours the American West. The next rodeo, I believe, is February 24th and 25th. It's been running since 1984, the Bill Pickett Invitational Rodeo.
Yeah. And so next, should we move on to Jackson Sundown?
Yes, please.
All right. Jackson Sundown was a Native American from the Nez Perce tribe, a tribe which was famed for their horse riding. Okay. And he was most likely the greatest rodeo cowboy rider ever. And one of the most famous events of his whole life was when, in fact, if anybody learned that he was entering an event, a lot of them would just drop out because they knew who he was going to win. That's how good he was. All right. And most famously in 1916, when he was 53 years old, and he was like twice as old as most of the other contestants, he entered the roundup in Pendleton. Okay. And even though he was twice as old as most of the other competitors, he won going away. And he agreed to ride a notoriously fierce horse named Angel. And Angel bucked furiously, twisted in circles, and exploded in the air. But Sundown stayed on the whole time. And when he was finished, the judges signaled he was finished. He got off the horse and took off his hat and fanned Angel, the horse, to cool him down. And the crowd went wild. Okay, and he was a huge crowd favorite. And he rode great, and he always looked good. And you have one of the pictures there of him and his. Oh, you already showed it, didn't you? Of him and his.
The next slide will show him in another fancy outfit there.
Yeah, he's cool. He's cool looking, isn't he?
Yeah.
So that was Jackson Sundown, and one time, of course, he not only rode horses, he could ride bulls. And he rode one that was again a notoriously menacing creature. And after Jackson Sundown rode him, the bull refused to ever buck again.
Yeah, Jackson Sundown is a great character. He's actually somewhat related to our Powder River Basin. He was the nephew of the great Chief Joseph, the Nimipu chief, or Nez Perce chief, who in the summer of 1877, they attempted to flee from Wallowa County, Oregon, their native homelands there, and make their way north to Canada in its attempts to join up with Sitting Bull and his band that were just on the other side of the U.S.-Canada border. And Jackson Sundown was a teenager at the time. He did make it, despite Chief Joseph surrendering and not quite making it to Sitting Bull. There were a handful of Nimipu or Nez Perce who made it with Blanket of the Sun or Jackson Sundown to Sitting Bull, and they spent 2 summers with Sitting Bull there in Canada before he made his way back to Montana and into Oregon. Jackson Sundown was a great rodeo performer, and like you said, one of the best saddle bronc riders in the circuit. The amazing thing was he didn't start rodeoing until he was 43 years old. So his entire life, he's competing against guys half his age as a rodeo star. And he was involved in my favorite Pendleton Roundup story. It's the 1911 Pendleton Roundup. I grew up in Pendleton, right there next to the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and Jackson Sundown competed against 2 other men in the finals of the 1911 saddle bronc competition in Pendleton. A black man from Pendleton by the name of George Fletcher, and then a white man by the name of John Spain or John Despain, depending on which history you're looking at. But Jackson Sundown, George Fletcher, John Spain, they went head-to-head in the saddle bronc competition. And over on the Facebook page for the official Pendleton Roundup, you can see archival footage of this 3-man showcase. Jackson Sundown went first. Unfortunately, when he tried to get off on the pickup man's horse, he was knocked to the ground and carried from the rodeo grounds on a stretcher. Wow. George Fletcher, who you see here riding a bison into the ground, oftentimes he would be challenged to ride a bison. This particular one in 1911, he ran it till it was exhausted and it collapsed. Wow. Right there in Pendleton. But George Fletcher, he rode his first horse, and he was fluid. He was known as kind of a rubber band rider. He could rake the horse and still maintain that ease of a perfect buckaroo. Unfortunately for Fletcher, the judges kept having him do re-rides. At the time, you didn't just ride one horse. You rode until the judges told you to stop. He rode 3 different horses. All 3 times, the crowd cheered wildly for this black cowboy from Pendleton, Oregon. Unfortunately, when it was all said and done, John Despain, he was awarded first place to the groans and moans of the audience. At that point, the sheriff from Pendleton, Tillman Taylor or Till Taylor, he stepped out, white man. He stepped out, grabbed Fletcher's floppy cowboy hat off his head and started tearing it into pieces. And he sold those pieces into the crowd. It's estimated the final total was about $500. He used that $500 to buy a championship saddle for George Fletcher, and he was awarded the People's Champion Trophy. So long before The Rock in WWE, we had a black cowboy of Pendleton, Oregon fame, George Fletcher, the original People's Champion. The unique thing about George Fletcher, as a young man, he did experience some hardships and racism in the school system in Pendleton, Oregon. So he actually transferred over to the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation, and he went to the mission school there with the native children, and that's who taught him how to be a rodeo cowboy and how to ride. His first bucking horse was a barrel that his native friends would rock back and forth until he learned to ride, and he learned to rope, cowboy, the whole bit on the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. So that's one of my favorite stories from my childhood, and it fit right in there with your book. So thank you for letting me share that with you, Mr. Mifflin.
Sure. Well, and then the next person we're going to talk about is a woman called Stagecoach Mary Fields. And she was a 6 foot tall, 200-pound woman. Okay, and she came west in order to work on a what do you call it? With a woman who was a nun. Okay, at a convent. That's the word I'm looking for. She worked at a convent. She did everything. She did carpentry. She did cooking. She did everything. And her story is that she was the first African-American woman, only the second woman to ever get a job with the United States Postal Service. And she did it because when she was 63 years old, she was the fastest person competing for this job to hitch a team of 6 horses up to the stagecoach, the fastest. Okay, so she won the job. All right, and then she became famous for she'd like deliver mail, everything, through all types of weather. I mean, snowstorms, everything. And if the snow got too deep for her horses, she'd tie them to a tree and she'd put on her snowshoes and delivered it herself, and she never missed a day of work, and she was really beloved. Okay, and one of my favorite stories about her, I have 2, is one time her wagon and she were attacked by a pack of wolves, and they tipped the wagon over, and her horses ran off, right? But she stayed through the entire night fending the wolves off with her pistol and her rifle, and in the morning she tipped the wagon back up. She recovered some of her horses, hitched them up, and rode away and delivered her package, which is kind of amazing. And another thing that isn't in my book because it's kind of like for older people is that she had a standing bet in bars that she could knock anybody out with one punch. She had $100 on it that but no one ever took her up on it. So that is kind of amazing to me too. And she also loved baseball. And the earlier picture you showed her, she would raise flowers, and because in addition to being she liked to be rough, she liked to be rowdy, but she also liked to be loving. She liked to babysit, plant flowers and tender garden, and she would give away bouquets to the baseball players a lot of times. And she's just an all-around interesting person.
Yeah, she was a great character. My favorite quote about Stagecoach Mary came from an Ebony article in their magazine in 1959 when American actor and Montana native Gary Cooper said, "Born a slave somewhere in Tennessee, Mary lived to become one of the freest souls ever to draw a breath for a 38.
That's for sure. That was a good one. That's a good quote. Next, I'm going to do one about a guy called Bronco Sam Stewart, who is born of mixed African, Mexican, and European ancestry in Mexico. And he came north from Texas with the very first herd of cattle brought to Wyoming. And his trail boss, Bill Walker, said Sam wasn't afraid of anything and could ride everything. And he was, in fact, just about as wild as the broncs he rode. But one day in 1870, his crew decided the horses weren't enough, so they roped the biggest longhorn in the herd, put a saddle on it, and challenged Sam to ride through Cheyenne. Well, Sam jumped on the steer and rode it down Main Street with his crew whooping and hollering. And his at the end, the Sam steer was frightened and wild-eyed. And when it saw itself reflected in the window of a clothing store, it stopped for a second, pawed the ground, and then charged right through the window of the store, going down the aisles, over the counter, around the shelves. And it picked up everything, all kinds of clothes on its horns. It picked up pants, coats, hats, even underwear. And, he rode it through the store and right back out into the street. When he got out to the street, he said, "Hey, I bought a suit for everybody." And later, Sam returned the steer to the herd, and he came back and went into town. And the owner of the store was understandably unhappy and came out to meet him. And Sam just smiled, apologized, and asked what the damages were, and peeled off the $350, which he gave to the store owner, and that would be about $7,600 now. But that was Sam Stewart, famous guy.
Yeah, Bronco Sam, he's a Wyoming great there. He worked ranches both in Laramie and down around Cheyenne. He is what would be considered an Afro-Indigenous cowboy. I do want to recommend a new book that came out, An Afro-Indigenous History of the United States by Kevin Mays, that lets you discover more about that. And it actually leads into one of our local cowboys, a man whose official name was Shields Wright. He was known as White Eagle, and then later in life, Chief White Eagle. He was a mixed-raced cowboy. He had been born near Eufaula, Oklahoma. It's quite possible he was a Muskogee, or as they are sometimes referred to, Creek Indian. He has been linked to several different Lakota possibilities as well. Nobody really knows for sure. We just know that the reports were that he was a Native American with piercing blue eyes. He also was born deaf and mute, but he didn't let those challenges stop him. His most famous act in his life, probably aside from being a poet and a cowboy, was in 1922 when he made a famous horseback ride from Sheridan, Wyoming to Omaha, Nebraska in order to promote the Custer Battlefield Highway. He was a publisher here in Gillette and was a famous a poet as well, wrote lots of cowboy poetry. In 1912, the Gillette News published a brief introduction to him, and it started with, "Few towns can boast an Indian rider. This Gillette can do with impunity," and went on to describe about how they're hoping that Shields Wright or White Eagle will continue to publish editorials and poems here in the Gillette News. One of his books that he self-published was he went around town and convinced the women of Gillette to share their best recipes. And right here in our gift shop, we still sell the Gillette Cookbook, published by Shields Wright or White Eagle.
Next, we got, we're moving on to Nat Deadwood Dick Love, okay? And he was probably the coolest. He had the coolest hair, probably the coolest name, Deadwood Dick, okay? And was in all likelihood, the coolest guy on the range. Okay, and he was won the Deadwood 4th of July rodeo contest when he was 22, and he won almost every event, including rope, throw, tie, bridle, saddle, and bronco riding contest. And after his incredible performance, Nat Love was given the sobriquet, the nickname Deadwood Dick. And at one point, he was kidnapped by Pima Indians who shot him a number of times. But they rescued him and nursed him back to health, and they wanted him to become part of the tribe and wanted to adopt him. But he had another idea. He stole a pony and escaped. And he is one of the most famous characters, with a nickname like that, right? How are you not going to be Deadwood Dick in the history of the Wild West? And later in life, he decided to settle down, and he got a job working on the railroad as a Pullman porter, and moved to Los Angeles, where he wrote about the exciting adventures of his life. And he's been featured time and time again on TV shows, and he even has a series of comic books which were dedicated to him.
Yeah, he's got a great story. His book that some of these images are taken from, it's a great read. Who knows how much of it is myth and legend, and it's all mixed in with a little bit of truth, I would imagine. But it is a great read. Right here in Gillette, we had our own black cowboy. It's estimated that 1 in 4 black cowboys came to the American West through the Texas cattle trade. One of those is a man by the name of Bunk Haynes. Bunk was associated with a outfit that settled near Devil's Tower, known as the Driscoll outfit. That family homesteaded around the base of the tower, America's first national monument, and they are still ranching out there to this day. Bunk was one of their hands. Bunk had been born enslaved in or near Seguin, Texas. And he was a young boy when the general orders were read, freeing all the slaves. That is now popularly known as Juneteenth throughout the nation now. It's taken a while, but when the general orders were read in June of 1865, letting everybody know that 2 years ago the Emancipation Proclamation had been passed and you are now free. Bunk is a unique character in that he was a cowboy. That was his task as an enslaved young man, was to care for livestock, horses, cattle. He was the boy who took care of cows and horses on the plantation there in Texas. As a free man, he continued to be a cowboy. One of the challenges that African-American cowboys had was this was a task that you had done as an enslaved person, and now you were able to make a living out of doing it, something that prior to the Civil War was not possible. Unfortunately for a black man, he in society is never seen as being truly a man. As long as he's fit and able, he's a boy. Once he is no longer fit and able, he's an uncle. He's never a man. He's a boy or an uncle. Bunk established himself here in Campbell County. His homestead was unlike any other. It's was down around what's now known as Fishing Lake. At the time, it was known as Bunk's Reservoir. And Bunk's Reservoir was a homestead where boys in the county would go and hunt rabbits and ducks and make sure to stop into Bunk's place for some of his delicious rabbit pie. Travelers on the Black and Yellow Trail, on their way to Deadwood, on their way to Casper, on their way to Bozeman, they always went out of their way to make a stop at Bunk's homestead for some of his rabbit pie. Bunk unfortunately passed away in 1917 of cancer. He was at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. But he was so beloved by all the different outfits that he had worked for here, the money was paid to carry Bunc's body back by rail, and he was one of the first individuals to be buried up at Mount Pisgah Cemetery here in Gillette. Bronc was also a pretty well-known horse trainer, and until his death, he was the primary supplier for the Bighorn Polo Club located over in Sheridan, Wyoming. And of course, in 1918, they ran into a bit of a problem because all the horses from Wyoming were getting shipped overseas to fight the war effort in the Great War, or the World War I. And Bronc passed away. And so it took a few years. It was about 1921, 1922, almost 100 years ago now, before the Polo Club was able to get good quality horses for their competitions. Now, guys like Nat Love, Bunk Haynes, and others, they've got some great stories. And to find out more, one of the ones that is a great book is The Negro Cowboys. You see Deadwood Dick, Nat Love there on the cover, is a great book. And another one of my favorites for stories is Black Indians, covering, again, those Afro-Indigenous cowboys, the Black Cowboys, and the Native Cowboys all in one book. Thanks for letting us share that story there.
Sure. Moving on to the Buffalo Soldiers, they were, of course, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, basically, and they were the black soldiers, and they were used a lot in the Indian Wars, and in fact, they won 23 medals of honor in the Indian Wars, which was quite astonishing and great. And they were called the Buffalo Soldiers because they reminded the Native Americans, the Indians, of buffalo because of their hair. You know, their tight hair looked like a buffalo's head, and supposedly, and that's the reason they were called Buffalo Soldiers, and also because of their fighting spirit. And like I said, they won 23 medals of honor in the Indian Wars, and in the Spanish-American War, they were among the first people. The soldiers to go up San Juan and Kettle Hills in Cuba, and they were led by Blackjack Pershing. And I always wondered, why was he called Blackjack? You know, and it turns out, as I did some of the historical research, that he was a big supporter, a proponent of the Buffalo Soldiers, and so he was called Black in honor of their being black. More interesting to me is that the Buffalo Soldiers were some of the first National Park Service Rangers. They built roads into Sequoia and up Mount Whitney, and the first arboretum in Yosemite. And in fact, the Smokey the Bear, famous Smokey the Bear hat, came from the Buffalo Soldiers who used to wear it. And one of the most famous of all of them was a guy called Henry O. Flipper, who was the first African-American to graduate from West Point. And he was an engineer. And he designed the system that drained the swamp, which was creating a lot of malaria around Fort Sill. And it's still in use today. It's called Flipper's Ditch. And he later became an assistant secretary of the Interior and wrote scientific works. And he's a great guy.
Yeah, the Buffalo Soldiers were great. It was it's often believed the Cheyenne tribe here in the Northern Great Plains are the ones that gave them that moniker, Buffalo Soldiers. That same group of Buffalo Soldiers, the 25th Infantry, that were assigned to patrol Yellowstone, actually in 1876, they completed the what's known as the Iron Ride from Fort Missoula, Montana, all the way to St. Louis, Missouri, on bicycles, wood-rimmed bicycles the whole way. There is an organization called ironride.org that is going to recreate that ride later this year in commemoration of the 25th Infantry. They were a one of 4 units that over time had been assigned as Buffalo Soldiers, the 9th and 10th Cavalry, the 24th and 25th Infantry Regiment. Now, often in American history and in the classroom, we think of Buffalo Soldiers as the continuation of the U.S. colored troops that fought during the Civil War. And then they fought up until the Spanish-American War, and we forget about them, right? Well, the truth is the 24th Infantry Regiment, despite the president's orders of 1948, ordering all military units to be desegregated, the 24th Infantry would not be desegregated until 1951 during the Korean conflict. And so one of my favorite Buffalo Soldiers, and Robert, can we get that on the big screen? Was Second Lieutenant Jackie Robinson of the 9th Cavalry. He was stationed at Fort Riley, and he served with the Buffalo Soldiers of the 9th Cav as a second lieutenant from 1942 to 1944. We all know his baseball story, which is a great one, and shout out to Google today. The Google header is a shout out to the Negro Leagues. One of the great men to break the color barrier, also served as a Buffalo Soldier.
And then next, let's move on to like the Mexican Cowboys.
Yeah.
And the Mexican Cowboys were probably the oldest, most original, let's say, cowboys in the West. A lot of them, rode up from, came over from Spain, and they established these huge estates called the haciendas. The Spanish did, and they had people that were known as vaqueros, and that is actually the interesting thing to me here is that buckaroo actually came from the Spanish word vaquero, buckaroo, all right? And there were a couple other words that fascinated me too, like lasso is from the Spanish, rodeo, and Mustang. Most interestingly is the 10-gallon hat. And everybody, I always wondered, what does that mean? It looks like it can hold 1 gallon. What's this with 10 gallons? Well, actually, gallon was a word for a very narrow braided band. And so a 10-gallon hat, the Spanish gallon, was a hat whose crown could hold 10 of these braids. So that's where that came from. Never knew that before. And should you want to go into Mexican John now, or shall I go?
Sure, absolutely. I can do Mexican John real quick. The Vaqueros are a great culture of cowboy, and the cowboy buckaroo culture. Where I grew up, it's buckaroos, not cowboys. I'm a Pendleton buckaroo, is where I graduated high school from, and it does come from that the vaquero. But we did have our own vaquero here in Gillette. He's quite famous, a man by the name of Mexican John Marroquin. He was recently, as of 2018, inducted into the Wyoming Cowboy Hall of Fame. Here he's pictured out on the 4J or 4J Cattle Company, as was known at the time, ranch, and he's got himself a little a pronghorn or pronghorn antelope that is eaten out of his hand there. Mexican John, he was kind of a staple. He arrived on the Texas cattle drives in 1877, first down in Cheyenne. And in 1882, he met up with a local group, the Keyline brothers down there around Cheyenne, and they convinced him to join up with their outfit and come north to Gillette. And he ended up becoming a 4J ranch staple. Mexican John was always associated. Every time the ranch changed hands, he was still living in the cabin in the barn, in the bunkhouse there. And so he changed hands all the way until his death in 1946. He was best known as an expert with a bullwhip, and he was one of the best and most skilled at breaking the fiercest of broncs. One of the former owners of the 4J Ranch had told Mexican John that he was going to bury him next to George Amos, and the two of them would probably bicker for all eternity. And he kept his promise. So in 1946, after he died, he's buried up there at Mount Pisgah Cemetery right next to George Amos as well.
That was one of the biggest horses I've ever seen.
Yeah, it's pretty good size draft horse there.
Yeah, going back to the Spanish Cowboys, there was something called the Escalante Expedition, which took place in 1776. And it was an effort by these two Spanish priests, Anastasio Dominguez and Silvestre Escalante, to find a route from Santa Fe, New Mexico, to their mission in Monterey, California. So along the way, they made maps of the American West, and they were really the first kind of European people to explore and map this area. And they encountered along the way some Ute tribes who were very hospitable to them. Okay, and they trade gifts and food and so forth. And the leader of the Timpanogos tribal leader was amazed that they had gone through the territory they had safely, because it was Comanche territory. And actually the Ute word Comanche comes from the Ute word meaning anyone who wants to fight me all the time. Okay, so he was astonished. Well, at any rate, these guys, the Dominguez and Escalante, only got to the Grand Canyon, and they realized they couldn't cross it, so they never got all the way to Monterey. They turned around and went back, but they had great maps, and they had a great recording of the natural riches that they had found along the way. And that was in 1776, which is kind of amazing to me. And the next one I want to talk about is the Tejanos, which was Mexicans who lived in East Texas, basically. And one of the most famous was the De Leon family, and they were wealthy. She was particularly wealthy, came from Mexico and went up and founded a colony up in East Texas. And they also were Texas freedom fighters. They fought with against Santa Anna and helped like Stephen Austin and helped the Texans beat Santa Anna and gain independence for Texas, the Republic of Texas. And there are lots of their family who were involved in that, getting arms for Austin and so forth. And they also established Mexican culture with the churches and schools and so forth, and had the largest Mexican Tejano community in Texas. And that leads us right to the Paniolos.
Yeah, so our cowboy culture here in America was heavily influenced by Vaqueros and the Spanish, and that same is true even for Hawaii. A lot of people don't realize this or even know it, but cowboy culture in Hawaii actually began before it began in Texas. The cowboy culture initially started at the end of the 18th century in the 1790s when cattle first arrived via the Spanish on the Hawaiian Islands, or the Sandwich Islands as they were known at the time. And the king of Hawaii, he hired some Españols to come and teach how to herd cattle and ranch there in Hawaii. Those Españols, that term gets translated in Hawaiian to Paniolo. And a cowboy in Hawaii to this day is known as a Paniolo. It's an extension of that Espanol or a Vaquero culture and history. And in 1908, three of the best Paniolos from the what's now the great state of Hawaii come to Cheyenne to compete at the Frontier Days competition. Archie Kaawa, Jack Lowe, and Ikua Purdy. Ikua Purdy ended up taking the championship roping title that year. He was first, Archie came in third, and Jack came in sixth. These three men are all cousins. their parents, brothers and sisters. Jack Lowe, he was the great grandson of John Palmer Parker of Hawaii's Big Island in Waimea, the Parker Ranch. All three men have history with the Parker Ranch, and there's a big, huge statue, larger than life, of a coyote right there at the entrance to the ranch center, where they still preserve Paniolo heritage and they practice it as well. These three cowboys come to Cheyenne, they pose for photos, they stand out. This was back when the steer roping, where you were roping a full-sized a bull. It wasn't a 3 or 4 year old or a calf. You were roping a 5 to 7 year old steer, so a full-size steer that they're roping. Ikua Purdy, he actually is not only associated with the Parker Ranch, but over on the island of Maui for 24 years of his life, he served as the ranch foreman at the Ulakpalakua Ranch, which is one of the most historic ranches in all of Hawaii, in there on Maui. They're actually not only preserving the Paniolo way of life with their ranch hands today, but they also are one of the foremost and forefront environmental protection, and it's almost like a nature preserve or a national park, the way they care for that ranch to this day. Those three men kind of changed the way that rodeo was perceived. Cheyenne was and is still considered one of the top rodeos in the world. And these men showed up. They had the funny Paniolo hats with the Hawaiian lei as a hat band around, and they wore colorful clothes similar to the way Jackson Sundown did. And they kind of stole the show, despite the weird looks and the jeers that they got at the beginning of the week. By the time the rodeo was over, everybody was remembering them. And a book that just came out this last couple years, Aloha Rodeo, tells the story of these three men and the Cheyenne Frontier Days rodeo of 1908.
Next, Bass Reeves. Bass Reeves is one of the most astonishing stories in the West. He was the sheriff in the Indian Territory, which was over 75,000 square miles. And he worked for the Judge Isaac Parker, who was known, I think, as the hanging judge. And Bass Reeves was arrested more people than Wyatt Earp and Wild Bill Hickok put together. He brought over 3,000 criminals to justice. And he was probably the person upon whom the Lone Ranger, you can see him down there at the bottom, the story of the Lone Ranger is based on. He would give away silver dollars. He would leave a silver dollar at the site of where he had made an arrest, and people say, well, that's kind of like the silver bullet, that the Lone Ranger had. And the amazing, he would wear costumes. He never shot unless he had to. And he was only shot once, and that was through the top of his hat. He never got hit in his body, but he'd wear like disguises and costumes. He'd disguise himself as a hobo, he'd disguise himself as like another criminal and so forth. And he always got his man. And the interesting thing to me is that he said, in his own words, he said, maybe the law ain't perfect, but without it, we got nothing. And I think that's just, it's probably true. It is true. And he was a great proponent of justice. And in fact, his son once killed his wife, not his wife, not Bass Reeves, but the woman the son was married to. He killed her because he thought she was having an affair. And Bass went out and tracked him down and brought him back to justice. He said, you broke the law. You got to pay for it. And the amazing thing was that the judge, Bass Reeves, was so respected that the judge actually just let the kid off with a long prison sentence instead of hanging him, which they would have hung most people back then for killing somebody. But I thought, gee, that's not since the Roman Republic did you hear about many people who would do that, who would obey the principles of justice and put them ahead of their own child. And so the name is Bass Reeves. He's an incredible person. And as I said, the Lone Ranger was probably based upon him. And next, do you want me to do Saul Starr? Okay, there's in the book, the True West, there's chapters about everybody, because my contention is my observation is that the West may have been more of an actual melting pot than the East Coast, where in the East Coast you had all your neighborhoods. You had Chinatown, you had the Italian section, you had the Irish section, but out West, the people were sort of forced to live and work together. And in fact, when people say you were black cowboys, I say, yeah, well, after the Civil War, you had all these suddenly freed men who were young men who needed a job. There was no welfare system. There was no way you had to go out and you had to work and you had to make your own way. So that had a lot to do with the fact that there were, black cowboys, approximately 1 in 4 in the West, but there were also, Jews in the West. And in fact, the famous pants, the Levi's were marketed by the guy Levi Strauss, and the guy that we're going to talk about right now is Saul Starr, who was. Why don't you take the Saul Starr story?
All right. Well, Saul Starr, he is of Deadwood fame. Just down the road from us here in the Black Hills is Deadwood, South Dakota. For over 10 years, Saul Starr served as the mayor of Deadwood. Saul was connected to another famous Deadwood character, a man by the name of Seth Bullock. Seth Bullock and Saul Starr were originally in business together as ranchers. They established the Starr Bullock Ranch, or the SB Ranch, along the Belle Fourche River in what is now Belle Fourche, South Dakota. That ranch is why Belle Fourche exists to this day. Saul Starr and Seth Bullock were pretty good businessmen, and they saw the potential to set up a railroad depot there near their ranch. That railroad depot that they sold to the railroad ends up becoming the foundations of the geographical center of the United States, Belle Fourche, South Dakota. When they sell that ranch off, they take those interests and then they move to Deadwood. Saul Starr becomes the mayor. Starr and Bullock, they go into business, they open a hardware store, and then the most impressive addition to the city of Deadwood that still stands to this day is the Bullock Hotel. Yes, it takes Seth Bullock's name, but it was built through the interest of both Saul Starr and Seth Bullock and their partnership together over there in Deadwood. And it is on my bucket list. Even though it's said to be haunted, I would like to go and stay a weekend at the Bullock Hotel one day. It is an impressive structure that still stands over there in Deadwood.
Ghosts will be scared of you. Let me tell you the truth. Ghosts are going to run the other way.
Right, I hope so.
Okay, now there's another Jewish person, Josephine Marcus, that I'll briefly talk about. She was 19 or 20 years old, and she was one of the few actual witnesses on site at the shootout at the OK Corral, which involved Wyatt Earp. And later, she became the common law wife of Wyatt Earp, and they lived together for 45 years. And in fact, Wyatt Earp is buried in her family's Jewish cemetery in Colma, California. So that's all for her. And next, let's move on to Wild Bill Hickok. Okay, when I was writing this book, the publisher was saying, "Yeah, you really want to put, this is all about, like black people and women and Native Americans and stuff." And I said, you got to have Wild Bill Hickok in there. Gee, that it's like not having him and Buffalo Bill Cody in the book, which I insisted on having, is like talking about gravity and not mentioning Einstein. Okay, he was just one of the most famous cowboys ever. He was born in Illinois. His father was an abolitionist who helped slaves escape through the Underground Railroad. And during the Civil War, Bill spied for the Union Army and was later a scout for General George Custer and the Buffalo Soldiers. He was known as an outstanding shot. And so he was elected marshal in a lot of like basically lawless frontier towns. And there was one in Hays, Kansas, in which he tried to control a rowdy crowd during a street brawl. Okay, and the leader of the gang was firing a pistol in the city limits, which was not legal. And Bill told him to put his gun down. And the guy turned on Bill and went to fire him. Bill drew first, boom, bang, he was down. The guy was dead. And so Bill turned to the crowd of drunken cowboys who were with the man he just shot and said, "Now, do any of you fellows want the rest of these bullets?" And nobody said a thing. And so on. Wild Bill Hickok had a reputation justly earned as just being an amazing shot, and also taking over towns and creating a peace in these towns like Abilene and so forth. And he also, of course, was included in the Wild West show. Okay. And he started his own called The Daring Buffalo Chasers of the Plains, with 6 Native Americans, 6 buffalo, a bear, and a monkey. And during one of the shows, the buffalo escaped from their pen and chased the screaming members of the audience all around the grounds. which wouldn't you love to have that on film? And it's like, not surprisingly, he wasn't really interested in being a showman. So like when he was in the Wild West show, he often hid behind the scenery. And once when they put a spotlight on him, he shot it out with his pistol. And so that was more or less the end of his showbiz career. And of course, when he was shot himself from behind while playing poker, holding 2 aces and black 8s, and poker players now call that the dead man's hand in honor of Bill. Now, the woman who loved Buffalo Bill was the famous Calamity Jane. And Calamity Jane is obviously one of the great nicknames of all time. All right. And people speculate on how it came to be. And some said that she used to tell people that anyone who crossed her was courting calamity. Okay. And she was wild and free. She did exactly what she wanted to do and told everybody exactly what was on her mind. She dressed like a man and could shoot like a man. And she became more famous than Wild Bill. And in her own words, she said, "I figure if a girl wants to be a legend, she should go ahead and be one." And so when Wild Bill's wagon train was pulling into Deadwood, the local newspaper announced the event with the headline, "Calamity Jane has arrived," because she was the star. Okay. And in the picture there, you see her driving a stagecoach. And that's another incident in her life in which she was in a stagecoach, and the guy who was driving was shot with an arrow and killed. And Jane took the whip and took over and drove the stagecoach to safety, while the 6 men, I guess, which would have included me if I had been there, were sat cowering in the stagecoach and let her do it. She was a great storyteller, and the stories of her live on in books, televisions, movies, and over 10 movies, in fact. And she did become the legend that she thought she should be. Of course, she was also a kind of a legendary drinker too. But you got to do something, right?
Right.
Oh, should I go on to my next one?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, here's one of my favorite ones, which is Fox Hastings. Fox Hastings was a woman who ran away from a convent when she was 16 years old, a convent in California, and she was determined to become a rodeo star, and she did. And she was a bulldogger in her own right, much like Bill Pickett. You know, she'd jump off the horse, she'd get him around the neck and wrestle him to the ground. And she was voted the outstanding act of the Texas rodeo, including men as well as women, because she was just terrific as a rodeo star. And she broke her ribs, and she got right back up and just continued competing for 3 days, bulldogging for 3 days in a row. And another time, her horse fell on top of her. She got up, hopped on another horse, and completed her ride. She was, as I said in the headline, she was pretty as a picture and tough as nails. And that was something that was, I think, more or less the way they used to describe her in ads. And amusing to me that one of the person, I got lots of good reviews for this book, a bunch of them, but one woman took exception to the fact that I called her pretty as a picture and tough as nails, and saying, what's wrong with him, meaning me, that he would describe her as pretty as a picture. Well, you know what? She was. So there. At any rate, the next person is Mamie Halfley. And Mamie Halfley is another amazing woman, cow person, who she said in her own words, and this is in the West where I was raised, women are by no means the weaker vessel, okay, which is really interesting. She grew up basically in Wisconsin, but she got into these Wild West shows, and she could ride anything. She could stand up on the back of a hard charging pony and ride it standing up. She could shoot targets out of the air that a cowboy would throw alongside her. She had like targets shot out of her mouth, which by another woman, which is like, I'm not sure you could talk me into that.
Right.
But her most amazing thing was she was famous for her diving horse. And I can even remember this, a diving horse as a kid. And it used to be an act. There were kinds of great big amusement parks all over the country when she was doing it. And like Dreamland Park on Coney Island and in Atlantic City. And they would go, she and the horse would go up onto a platform 50 feet in the air. And she somehow or another get her horse to dive into a 10-foot pool. And and you can see it in the little picture down there at the bottom of the page. That's an actual picture. And of course, she I mean, a couple times she got like knocked unconscious and so forth, but she broken ribs and so forth. But she just like Fox Hastings, she never gave up. She always honored her contract and did what she said she had come to do, no matter how hurt she'd been. Now, her real life was kind of like sometimes just as tough as diving off a platform at 50 feet in the air. Once she was on a train in her berth resting, and she heard outside her berth, she heard the porter saying, no, please don't kill me. And the guy, his attacker, had a knife. She said, he's going to cut your heart out. Well, Mamie pulled her pistol, stuck it out right into the guy's face, and said, you aren't cutting anybody's heart out, and pulled back the hammer and click. And, he deferred to her position. So she is in the Cowgirl Museum and Hall of Fame in Fort Worth, of course. I mean, most of these people are in the best, cowboy museums that you can imagine.
Absolutely. And both of those ladies you just mentioned, both Mamie and Fox, are part of a man who was a photographer at the time in their era, a man by the name of Russell Doubleday. And Doubleday had his girls, the rodeo girls. And in 1908, he snapped a photograph of all the Doubleday girls at the Cheyenne Frontier Day Rodeo. There on the left-hand side of your screen, you see Mamie and Fox. And then over on the right-hand side, the second one in, in kind of an outrageous outfit there is a lady by the name of Prairie Rose Henderson. And Prairie Rose was born on February 5th in 1875, so it would have just been her birthday a couple days ago. She was born in Ohio and raised early on in Nebraska and eventually here in Wyoming, raised on a ranch. She was a skilled competitor at both gymnastics, horseback riding, and she was a relay and solo racer as well. She became the very first female bronc rider at the Cheyenne Frontier Days. Some say it was 1899, and some say it was 1900, and some say it was 1901. Whatever year it was, Prairie Rose was the first female to ride bronc, a saddle bronc at the Cheyenne Frontier Day Rodeo. In 1911, she won the World Championship bronc rider title, and in 1913, she won the saddle bronc contest at the Los Angeles Rodeo. Here in this picture, she's riding a horse by the name of Miss Cheyenne, also a photograph by Doubleday, at the Frontier Day Rodeo, probably around 1919 or 1920. However, in 1917, she won it all at Cheyenne, the world's greatest rodeo. She became the saddle bronc champion in 1917, and she was presented a championship silver buckle by the Union Pacific Railroad Company. Prairie Rose, like all the other Doubleday girls, is well known for her fashion. She designed and produced all of her own outfits, just like all the other women we saw in that picture earlier. She was famous, however, because she would include ostrich fur, she would include fur of other animals, sequins, and she wore those famous Turkish-style pants, all designed by her. She was a part of the Irwin Brothers Wild West show, and unfortunately, she would tragically die in a snowstorm down around Green Mountain in Fremont County, Wyoming. However, her body was not recovered until probably about 6 years later by a sheepherder who was out in that region after a recent summer wildfire had gone through the region. He found her remains leaning up against a tree there near Green Mountain in 1939. They knew she had gone missing during a snowstorm in the winter of 1932 or 33. It's assumed she died sometime in that 1933 portion of that storm. Now, some folks ask, well, there's probably not a whole lot of remains left to identify her with. She didn't have a driver's license on her, and nothing like that. The way they identified Prairie Rose Henderson was by that silver buckle that she had won at Cheyenne in 1917 that the Union Pacific Railroad had presented her with. That was the only way to identify her remains all those years later.
Wow. Well, I think I'd like to thank you for inviting me to do this with you, and I've learned a lot from you, as I learned a lot from writing the book, The True West, available on Amazon, of course. And right now, I think we're going to talk about Charlie Willis. And Charlie Willis was, his nickname was the Singing Cowboy, and he was a skilled horseman, and he could break horses too. But his main talent was as a musician, and he wrote the popular song "Goodbye Old Paint." And his nephew, when they interviewed him, said one of his big gifts was that he could have a soothing voice, and he'd sing to the cattle and calm them down. And I think everybody kind of knows a little bit about the song "Goodbye Old Paint," and you're going to play, I think right now, Dom Flemons' version of it, right?
Yes, we are. Dom's a friend of the museum, so hopefully the next slide works, and we'll hear a little bit of "Goodbye Old Paint."
I'm leaving Cheyenne. Farewell, fair ladies, I'm leaving Cheyenne. Goodbye, my little Donny, my pony.
Well, we got a little bit of it there. You can find several versions of "Goodbye Old Paint" by Don Flemons, the American Songster, on YouTube. So just do a quick Google search there for that. Before we go, we do have one more slide that actually features a song by you, Mifflin. Can you tell us a little bit about the song?
Yeah, it's a song from, I wrote that book, as I told you before, about Cowboy Howie, and I wrote it as an animated movie and a story with songs. And it's about, as I said, a mixed race kid from New York City who wants to be a cowboy. And people tell him, you can never be a cowboy, all right? And he runs into a mentor who is working at the Brooklyn Zoo who sings this song called Broncbustin Man, who tells him, yeah, you can be, there were black cowboys and everything, and you can be one. So this one is called Broncbustin Man, and the basic theme of it is the animals don't care what you are. You're just a two-legged human being as far as like steers and horses and so forth and bulls are concerned. So that's sort of what the song is about. It's called Broncbustin Man. You can hear it on locokids.com for free.
All right.
Okay.
Well, that's unfortunate.
Well, I can sing I'll just sing one.
All right, go ahead and sing a little bit.
Well, the bucking Bronco, he don't care.
Oh, there it is.
Well, a wild Mustang, he don't care about your nationality. All he knows is that he wants to keep on running free. You got to chase him just as hard as you can. Yeah, 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 you're a Broncbustin Man. Yeah, 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 you're a Broncbustin Man.
Well, despite all of our technical difficulties, I do want to say thank you so much for joining us today, Mr. Lowe. It's been a pleasure to highlight your book, The True West, available here in our gift shop. So swing on in today, pick up a copy for your family. Also, local kids and Amazon and all your other booksellers. Go out there and get yourself a copy, definitely.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks for all your kind words. And it's for basically, it was written for kids 8 to 12, but I think everybody who reads it learns a lot, because I know I learned a lot writing it rather. So thanks again. It's been a real pleasure, and whoopee-ki-yay.
Yes, excellent. Yeah. Thank you so much again. Thank you to all of our viewers for sticking with us. We went a little bit over time, so I apologize for that. This video will be archived to the YouTube channel for the Campbell County Rockpile Museum. There you can, we've got all kinds of books from our Rockpile Readers playlist. We have all sorts of programs that cover the history of the Powder River Basin. This program will be archived as one of those there on our YouTube channel. We do thank you all for tuning in today, both on Facebook Live and YouTube. We'll see you next time here at the Campbell County Rockpile Museum. Again, if you're anywhere in Campbell County, swing by and pick up a copy of for yourself. This is an excellent book. It's one of my favorite in my collection that I have now. Thank you all very much. Thank you, Mr. Lowe. Until next time, goodbye and have a good one.
Same to you.